Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Historia Canadiana, the show where we discuss history, literature, and culture in Canada. Today on the show, we have a guest, and our guest is the author of 8 books of nonfiction, including We Are Born with the Songs Inside Us, Lives and Stories of First Nations People in British Columbia, which came out in 2013. And she is also an award-winning freelance journalist who lives on Gabriola Island in British Columbia. Today, to discuss her new book, This Place Is Who We Are, I'm happy to have on the show Katherine Palmer-Gordon. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Patrick. It's wonderful to be here.
Now, can you start by telling listeners what exactly your book is, for those who might not have an awareness of it?
Sure. The book's title, This Place Is Who We Are, can speak for itself in certain ways, but the broad theme of the book that I wanted to convey is about the essential, what I'll describe as the interconnection of people, place, and well-being. Those three things in an Indigenous worldview are fundamentally connected. And so the book tells that story or illustrates that theme through the voices of and stories of some of the Indigenous peoples of the Great Bear Rainforest of central North Coast British Columbia, talking about the context of how the places that they're from are so fundamentally part of their identity, or they're defined by these places as Indigenous people. So they talk about the work they do, the context of their experiences in life and the communities they're from. You know, these are communities where their ancestors have lived for millennia, and what that means in the 21st century in Canada.
Absolutely. And I'm curious, how did you come to be interested in this particular topic? Because it is quite specific in a way, right? It's a specific region, specific subject. So why this topic?
Yeah, I've had incredible good luck to work with Indigenous peoples around the world, actually. Both, this is a New Zealand accent that people are hearing. So both in Aotearoa, New Zealand, as well as British Columbia and more broadly in Canada for, gosh, close to 25 years now. And as you mentioned, I've done some journalism. I've written some of those stories just to amplify Indigenous voices, to talk about, connection, to talk about the contemporary issues that engage Indigenous peoples in Canada today. And in the course of doing that work and in getting to know many of the Indigenous people that I've had the privilege and honor to work with, I realized that about 5 years ago now, it's been a journey to produce this book, that it still is very timely, universal story to share here about human connection to place. And yes, these are stories that focused on some voices from the Great Bear Rainforest in British Columbia, but they are very universal. These are people I've already known or gotten to know over the last 5 years, in terms of working with them to share their stories. But that story about human connection to place is universal. The importance of understanding how integrally human well-being is connected to our environment. There's never been a better time right now. Climate change, unsustainable resource use management, the growing awareness of Indigenous voices and wisdom in environmental resource management. I thought, I want to gather what I've learned and experienced and help share that with the world. And happily, the people that I approached to talk to were very excited by that idea and very enthusiastically joined in the project.
Interesting. And yeah, I think that's an interesting point to raise. And as I mentioned before we started recording, I'm someone who's an English major in this case. I'm doing my studies in this, and it's refreshing to see that environmental aspect make its way into the idea of narratives and stories. And it's something that you bring up in your text as well, both from a narrative perspective and just in the way that Indigenous populations practice their cultures and their lives around them. And it's something that I think is vital to understanding new ways of addressing the climate catastrophe that we're facing today, or just new ways of approaching the world. And I think that's one of the better. That's one of the good things that I think your book is advancing in this case, in a way that's accessible to a lot of people, which unfortunately not a lot of climate discussion or environmental discussion is, I feel. But yeah, I feel like it was an interesting aspect of your book.
Thank you.
And you mentioned in this case, right, that you've been working with Indigenous populations across the world for many years now. And I'm curious, right, what you were hoping to do differently with this book in particular that perhaps hasn't been done with previous books, either of yours or other texts that have come out, since, as you mentioned, there are other discussions about Indigenous peoples that have emerged over the past decades. So,
Yeah, I think what I would really hope that people will get out of this book is something that I gained a huge appreciation for in the course of working with the Indigenous people who were in the book and telling their stories. I gained this huge appreciation. I hope readers will as well, of just that importance of connection to place that they're talking about. But in what's different about it is that the insights they're giving into the fact that they are literally the 700th generation
mm,
of Indigenous leaders. You know, most of them are quite young, who are continuing to take care of these places, these lands and waters that they're from. I mean, 700 generations, that's 14,000 years. That's, if you think
yeah,
about it, that is far longer than most of the civilizations I can think of, other civilizations on the planet. Rome,
certainly here in Canada. Yeah.
Egypt, certainly here in Canada. And you know they're doing it again. They're reclaiming. They're using those ancient ways. They're in a modern environment for in many cases. You know, some of the people in the book are from Campbell River and Vancouver Island, and anybody who's ever been there knows how industrialized and urbanized that is. You know, somebody from Kitimat is surrounded by aluminum smelter, methane production, all of this huge industrialization. And all of them, though, have also access to modern science, modern technology, recognizing their 21st century realities. All the same, what they're doing, what is different here, is understanding that they're looking back to the past,
Mm,
actually. These are not new ways of combating climate change. These are not new ways of sustainable resource management. And these are not new ways of taking care of human well-being within your environment. These are very, very ancient ways of doing it. And what these people are talking about is renewal, refreshing, applying those ancient laws, and they are laws, these ancient practices, language even as a system that recognizes how you take care of those, and cultural beliefs. And that's what they're doing to bring back environmental well-being, human well-being, and a better future for the next 700 generations, which is what their hope is. So I think that's a message that is a bit different to the way we've been talking about these. We've certainly been talking about bringing greater strength and power to Indigenous stewardship. But I think people will gain an understanding of what Indigenous people mean when they say we have to do it our way in the systems that we have learned through thousands of years of trial and error and experience and understanding and working with the land.
absolutely. And I find this idea very interesting of when you're saying that they're using these practices that are very old in many ways in order to construct a future. And your use of the next 700 generations, I think, is indicative because I recently found out actually that certain indigenous populations, this was on the East Coast where I live, and it's obviously not the same for every indigenous nation, but certain indigenous populations, when they were making laws, and this is why I was thinking of it, was because of your use of the term law in this case, had in mind future generations, right? And then what kind of impact these laws or ideas that they were putting into place in their societies would have, not on their own lifetime, but specifically, I think it was in 7 generations, if I remember correctly, was like, how would this impact? And I think it's something that many of us have lost as a concept, or at least an ability is to imagine those futures, or at least the impact of our future. Um, and I think that's particularly a particularly salient and important reminder in this case. Yeah.
It's a phrase
And
that comes up in many of the stories. It's for the generations yet unborn.
yes, thank you. That's an excellent way of phrasing it. I was looking for the phrase, but yes, thank you very much. And you mentioned this a little bit earlier of the title in this case, and I would like you to speak a little bit about that because I feel like it's short but very rich in its possibilities, right? And I'm curious to hear you speak a little bit more about the choice of words and how it perhaps informs the text as a whole.
It's a very deliberate choice of
Mm,
words, especially in the subtitle. But when I sat down and opened up a blank page on my computer to start actually the writing process, which is probably the smallest part of the whole process to produce a book like this. But I wrote down This Place Is Who We Are as a working title because to me it captured perfectly this theme of the way in which people are defined by the place that their ancestors have walked upon and paddled upon and survived and thrived upon for millennia. It really captures this concept that these places define not just who the people are, but their systems of management of the environment. If you live in a mountainous fjord, you manage the environment a little bit differently to if you live on a delta or on the prairies. So it defines how you go about resource management. It defines how you go about relating to each other. Again, if you live in very mountainous valleys, how you relate to the people in the next valley will be governed differently. It relates to the sense of well-being that people find and when they find and are in the place that they feel really connected to. And that doesn't necessarily have to be a place that's thousands of years old. It can be a place, Gabriel Island, where I've lived for 20 years, feels a place that I'm really connected to. So I think that title, it ended up as the final title, of course, because it captures that concept perfectly. And I think it's something that really resonates with many people. The subtitle,
yeah.
Stories of Indigenous Leadership, Resilience, and Connection to Place, I put together because it breaks down to the core elements of every story in the book. All the people who share their stories are taking or have taken leadership roles in their communities. All of them spoke of the struggle of overcoming the horrific impacts of colonization, which continue today, but also of that deeper resilience that I've already talked about a little bit. People who survive and thrive in a place for 14,000 years are pretty robust. And there's this huge resilience that comes from that history. And then, of course, connection to place speaks for itself in the context
Mm,
of environmental care and well-being.
absolutely. And I'm curious in this case. So, as you mentioned before, you've worked in New Zealand and in other places. And I'm curious, right, as someone who's not necessarily Indigenous, how would you approach a topic like this? And what are some of the difficulties that you had to face? And were these difficulties, how can I rephrase this? How are these difficulties transferred from a place like New Zealand into a place like Canada, for example, where obviously the Indigenous people are not the same?
It's true that Indigenous people are not the same. Maori in Aotearoa, New Zealand, Indigenous peoples in Canada, are very diverse even within their own communities. But I think there's some very common themes that come through. And certainly New Zealand, Australia's the same. The history of colonial treatment of Indigenous peoples, non-Indigenous treatment of Indigenous peoples, is equally poor in New Zealand to Canada. And I'm very conscious of that. And also as a non-Indigenous person who has always, in all of my writing, which is nonfiction, I'm telling other people's stories. I've done biography, I've done history, I'm doing cultural stories. And I think it's been important from day one for me to always take great care when you're telling other people's stories. You really have to honor people very faithfully. And then, in terms of working with Indigenous peoples, to amplify their voices. And I think that's a key phrase. It's about amplifying their voices. This book is not about me. It's not about my story. It's their story. And if you have that very firmly embedded in your consciousness, um, you have to also be conscious of what's happened to Indigenous peoples in this country and the harm that's been done, and ensure that everything I do does nothing to increase the harm, but is part of the journey to help healing. And so it's imperative for me to set the highest standard of care in everything I do in telling these stories. And I said earlier, it's part, this has been a 5-year process, and the writing's been almost the shortest part of that process, because of taking care and working with people. You have to have a very strong relationship. You have to build trust, and you have to honor that trust. You have to fulfill it every step of the way. And my essential fundamental bottom line is not to use anything that anybody shares with me without their full permission, fully informed consent, if you like. It's a good model for everything, how anybody would work with Indigenous peoples. And so I'll just give you an example. The practical process that I went through in writing the book: when I contacted people, I shared very fully what I thought the book was about, the process, what they could expect in writing, and committed to doing that if they were willing to participate in the book. And I knew some people already who knew me and my track record and were very confident already. Other people, there's nothing like saying to them, well, go and talk to so and so, go and talk, and see if you want to talk to me. If you don't, completely understood. I recorded every interview. I shared every transcript unedited with the people who'd been interviewed, for them to own and keep, to tell me, is there anything you don't want me to use? Now you see your words on paper. Because you can have a conversation, but when you see your words on paper, it can feel very different, right? I created story plans for each chapter that I shared with everybody in the chapter, and said, have I got it right? Is there anything you want to comment on? And got feedback. I shared drafts of every chapter, and anything that people wanted changed, I changed. Even the photographs I used, I sought permission. Which photos? Are you okay with me using these photos? Everything had to be approved. And then it doesn't just stop there in terms of the book then coming out. I think it's really important for non-Indigenous authors to honour the people's time that they've given to this book. And so the next steps when the book comes out shortly are, first of all the royalties I'm donating to the Coast Fund's Conservation Fund, which is Conservation Fund and the names of the First Nations who are featured in the book. So all the royalties will go to that Conservation Fund, Stewardship Fund. Coast Funds has actually been a great sponsor and supporter of this project. They're Indigenous-led and owned sustainable conservation fund and economic development fund in the Great Bear Rainforest. So they've really supported the idea of telling these stories. They're buying a whole huge bunch of books in advance to be able to give back to the people in the book, as well as their communities. And then I will go visit the communities and give some of my time back to going to the schools to visit, spending some time in each community. So that's why it is a process that I think, is honourable and is fundamental. As a non-Indigenous person, it's the bottom line of how you have to approach this kind of work to take great care and meet that standard of care.
Yeah. The kind of through line that I figured in your answer in this case is the idea of ongoing relationships, right? Or ongoing relationality, which, is something that I've heard many Indigenous people discuss, right, as both something that they encourage and an issue that they've had both within their own communities and with relationships with settlers, for example, where sometimes people will come in just for the research, get what they need, and leave. But that kind of ignores, right, the underlying element that a lot of these stories that are told are built out of a relationship of trust and a relationship of community, in a sense. And it's something that, as someone who does want to address Indigenous literatures in my own research, has to keep in mind. And yeah, thank you for that reminder. in this case, that it's vitally important for every step of the way, in this case, to actually engage with the Indigenous peoples that you're talking with and about. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think I've heard that story about researchers coming in and just taking information and leaving nothing behind. And, it's just wrong.
And we have this idea that it was very much a 19th or early 20th century thing when, anthropology was starting off or things like that. But no, it's still ongoing to this day in the 21st century. And it's rather unfortunate in this case.
Yes.
It's refreshing to see people avoid that as much as possible. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious in this case, it might not have been so, and I didn't send you this question before, but did you receive any pushback from any of the questions or research that you were trying to do? Or was it a pretty much a smooth sailing process from the get-go?
I'm really happy to say I didn't get any pushback. I got questions.
Mhm.
I think one person out of close to 100 people I spoke with said, no, I'm too busy. I'm not really interested. Talk to somebody else. So
That's fair.
totally understood and fair. But their rationale wasn't, you shouldn't be doing this. And again, I think, fortunately, because people saw the process and trusted in the process, that was part of it. The biggest challenge for me, ironically, was that I started this process. I've been doing all the layout and the background work in 2019, but I got underway contacting people in January 2020. I was working in New Zealand, and as you can imagine, if you look back to that period in our time, I did the entire book during COVID, and
Yeah.
includes all the interviews. And, in some ways, that was a huge silver lining because, all my work with Indigenous people, face to face meetings are really critical. They're really important. It's part of building relationship, being in the place itself. Now, fortunately, I'd been to pretty much all of the places that are in the book, or close by at least. Um, but I had to build relationships with people over the telephone, over Zoom, Google Meets, WhatsApp Meets, Facebook videos, you name it. I've got every video conferencing technology known to humankind. And everybody works differently with that. But the silver lining about it was that actually everybody was in the same boat. So a lot of people who spend a lot of time out on the land and water were stuck at home and embraced the opportunity to sit in their homes and be able to talk to me and share their stories. And, I had one chief, who's Chief Paddy Walkers, who's in the Guasalanakula story, The Sacred Connection. It took ages and ages and ages to finally pin Paddy down for a conversation, the first phone conversation. And at the end of the first 2 hours, he said, okay, same time again next week. And it was fabulous. So for the next 8 weeks, we had a 2 hour call every Thursday afternoon at 1 o'clock, and for everybody, it unfolded that way. And I think for many people, and this was true of my last book, We're Born with the Songs Inside Us, having the opportunity to share your story in a safe place is very liberating, especially knowing that they can tell me they don't want me to use any part of their story. That actually did not happen. Everybody was comfortable to share every aspect of what they said to me. And that's incredibly rewarding. And I'm incredibly grateful.
So, and switching to the content a little bit more explicitly of your book in this case, we've brought up already questions of identity, politics, and land in our discussion so far, and I'm curious, right, how you like what was the process of actually bringing all of these ideas together and putting them on the page, right? Because as you were mentioning, a lot of these came from discussion and interactions and in face-to-face meetings. So what's the process here of actually combining all of these elements onto a readable story in a sense?
It's the big question, isn't it? How did you write
Yeah.
that? I sometimes go back and read my books and go, gosh, how did I do that?
Right.
There is a certain magic that just comes into play when you sit down and start writing. But I'd say there's a couple of things that come to mind in thinking about drawing, how I drew all those themes together. One is that, when I started writing, I suppose I made a bit of an assumption, or maybe it was more of a goal, that I really wanted to write the stories in a forward-facing way. What is our, for the future generations yet unborn, what hope and optimism can we gain from looking at all these amazing things that people are doing now for the future? And there's just remarkable, beautiful people doing all this incredible work out there in the context of their indigeneity. But of course, as I started to talk to people, not one single person could talk about what they're doing now without first talking about the past. And I think I described that in the Gwasanakwilak story through the words of Jessie Hemphill, who's in there, when she said, you can't set the table for the next course until you've cleared it of the past. And so everybody talked about the impacts of colonial history. They had to, because you actually need to appreciate that. And we talk about a lot about the impacts of colonial history. And, we talked a little bit about what was different about this book. And I think what is different and what really came through for me, especially in terms of talking about how you integrate identity and politics and law and land, is I would hope that there isn't a Canadian who hasn't heard about the impacts of residential schools and of, colonial government actions against Indigenous peoples, who haven't heard about smallpox, who haven't heard about all these terrible things that happen. But do they understand? Do we all understand what we mean by the impacts of those things? If those things had been done to us as non-Indigenous people, we'd have terrible well-being as a result too.
Yeah.
But the difference here is you've got to understand the impacts of colonial history to appreciate just how much that impact has had. You also need to understand what it was like before settlers arrived, before, just how brilliant and sophisticated these systems of governance and law and stewardship and relationships were then. And I think people don't necessarily turn their minds to that aspect of our history, that there was an incredibly, right across the country, not just in the Great Bear Rainforest, these incredibly sophisticated civilizations, millennia-old civilizations. And to me, that was one of the most significant themes that came out of the book that I felt was really, really important to capture. And when you think about the context of the ways, from an Indigenous worldview, how the environment is taken care of, for example, and this theme that I mentioned right at the beginning of our conversation about the interconnection of people, place, and well-being, I talk about Indigenous law. Now, Indigenous law exists integrally, regardless of the Constitution, regardless of the Section 35 constitutional recognition of Aboriginal rights and title. Indigenous laws existed for thousands and thousands of years, and it's law that's predicated on the way in which the environment tells us how to manage it, not how we tell the environment we're going to manage it, which is a really important distinction that really came out of the conversations that I had with people in such a strong way. Because if you think about it, how we manage, we non-Indigenous governments or systems or communities, we tend to draw a line around a map for resource management. We'll protect that bit over here as a park. We'll, log and mine and extract all the resources from this bit over here on the map. And, human well-being, well, we just deal with that completely separate in a silo of social mechanisms that we try to deal with a lack of well-being. And, we'll even at a broader level, around that line on a map, we'll say, this is ours, that's yours over there. And that's how land wars start. But in an Indigenous worldview, it's a completely different way of governing that can be hard for us to wrap our minds around, because it is so different. But it makes so much sense when you overlay it on a landscape, that if the environment's telling us how to look after it, it brings us into the environment as part of it. So we can't survive. There's a saying in Te Māori worldview, the river, the land, the mountains is us, and we are the river, the land, the mountain. And it's true here. It's a phrase I hear here as well. So how can we separate ourselves from its well-being? And so these systems of Indigenous law, when you put them onto the landscape, talk about who's responsible for caring for this bit of land, who's responsible for caring for that resource. Fish swim up a river, and that river goes through multiple valleys and what we tend to call territories today. Well, if you draw a line around a map, how can you take care of those fish properly? What you need is a relationship with the people upriver and downriver to make sure that the fish thrive and survive and there's enough for everybody in the environment. And that's how those relationships are developed. That's how those protocols govern the way in which fish are managed. It's the same for trees, it's the same for people, it's the same for trading, and even how humans behave towards each other, all of those systems in place. And I really wanted that theme to come through in terms of not thinking about environmental stewardship just in terms of resource management or taking care of the lands and waters and ice in Canada, but what that means for us as human beings in those places.
Sorry. When I hear you speak, I'm reminded of something I read in Lee Maricle's collection of oratories called Memory Serves, which came out a few years ago. I don't know if you've read it, it's great. But there's a moment in which she talks about salmon in this case, and the actual movement of salmon and how she relates it to very real world catastrophes such as 9/11, right, which seems completely disparate, right? This idea of buildings collapsing on one end of the country impacting salmon movements in British Columbia would make very little sense to a lot of people. But the way that she was explaining it was as a way of bringing attention to this connection that the world has to itself, right? And that it's not just, as you're saying, these individual sections that can be exploited or mined, until there's literally nothing left, right? And that's why we call them sacrifice zones in many ways. I recently learned about that term, and it depresses me to no end. But it's we need to consider, right, that there is no such thing as an individual plot of land that can just be used without consequences, right? And yeah, I thought that was particularly interesting, and I guess brings me to my next question in this case, insofar as this idea of telling stories about the land and telling stories about different aspects of being and relationships, right? While making this book and while writing these stories and while interviewing these people, how did you come to see the relationship between these various types of storytelling and the leadership that is so central a theme to your book?
Great question. Storytelling is an art form. Storytelling in an Indigenous worldview, stories are often actually an expression of history, the law. It's an excellent way to teach. In Indigenous education, storytelling and repeating stories is a way of passing down from generation to generation the right way to behave, the right way to do things. And people talked about that quite a bit in their storytelling for the book. They're great great morals to be, especially for the children. They enlighten, they encourage, they inspire, they educate. Those are all characteristics of good leadership, as being able to tell stories in a way that inspires people, essentially, and helps them to be their fullest selves as who they are. And I guess in terms of how do you portray that in a book, in the written word, when a lot of this is oral storytelling, the power of oral storytelling and witnessing through, whether it's in the big house or it's just over a Zoom together or over a phone call together, that power is huge. and it really resonates in a way that allows people to take that story with them and keep it forever. How do you put that on the page then? I was very, very honoured when you used Lee Maricle's name in the same sentence as my book, because that is a huge honour. I think the way to tell stories, and I sometimes joke I tell stories for grown-ups, true stories for grown-ups is what I try to do, because my background, actually, I started off life as a commercial lawyer of all things, but
Interesting.
I value that. I value that hugely. My experience when I was working as a lawyer, because part of what you learn is how to write well. You have to identify the problem. You have to make sure you answer the questions that you aren't asked. You have to think through, what is the story I'm telling a client here about what they need to know. You have to write clear, concise sentences. You have to have done your research. All of those things train you in terms of writing discipline, if you like. But having said that, too, I'm building on the fact that I won my first writing award at the age of 7. So I've always liked to tell stories. And when you combine the two, it's an ability to be able to get across to your audience and readers. And you always have to think, who's your audience? Who's reading this? How do I want them to engage with the story and enjoy it and appreciate it and want to learn more? So it's a matter of combining that, very meticulous factual narrative. In part, that goes back to making sure I'm honoring these stories accurately and faithfully in the way that people intended them to be conveyed when they spoke to me. But doing it as an engaging narrative way as possible, trying to make them really three-dimensional on the page that people can, read the Gwasal and Aqueduct story and about what happened to them and what's happening now, and really feel it inside you, because it's so powerful. So that's kind of I think I went sideways to answer your question there, but storytelling leadership is a beautiful fundamental to share with people, and, as I say, enlighten, educate, inspire.
Right. And I'm curious in this case, so we've obviously talked about the impact of the past in this case, right, of settler colonialism, the residential schools, and so forth, on how a lot of these Indigenous communities want to build resurgence movements or resilience and so on. And I'm curious, right, when we think about the present and so far as we can, right, what do you see as the particular relevance of your text today? Like, why write this text now, and what do you hope for it to accomplish going forward?
Well, my goodness, there's probably two main things I would hope in terms of the timeliness of them. One is that I hope non-Indigenous readers will read this book and just be blown away by, just there's all these amazing, hardworking, brilliant Indigenous people all around us, and these systems of resource management and governance, and how they take care of themselves, that go back thousands and thousands of years. We talked about that a bit in Canada. That'll help build understanding and empathy. We talk a lot about reconciliation. What does that mean in Canada today? We can't possibly achieve reconciliation unless it's a true two-partner, two-eyed seeing way of looking at ourselves as a society, and so the greater the understanding we have of each other, the better. And I hope for Indigenous readers, particularly young Indigenous readers, that this resonates. There's recognition, there's hope, there's inspiration on that. There is a good future, that there is support for this kind of work, and they rightly can be very, very proud of who they are and their ancestry and the ancestors. We wouldn't have a Canada that boasts all this incredible environment and the richness of the resources in it, all our beautiful national parks, the fish and the trees and the resources in it would not have been as healthy and abundant, and our ability to survive and use those resources when settlers first arrived here if Indigenous people had not taken such good care of them. So we need to be so grateful and acknowledge and honor that. And I think, just frankly, again, in a time where humanity's kind of driving the planet into the ground, so to speak, in
Yeah.
terms of our mismanagement of resource use, that there doesn't seem to me to be a better time to be examining better ways to do things. And I mentioned in the book, at one point, that studies that have been done in Canada and Australia, Brazil, of Indigenous managed protected areas demonstrate unequivocally that biodiversity is greater by as much as 40% when you apply Indigenous management systems. Now, if we applied Indigenous management systems and methods to all of our resource management, doesn't mean we stop using resources. It means the opposite. It means we use them everywhere sustainably and wisely so that we can all flourish as well as the landscape. So timeliness, climate change, look at just in New Zealand, huge areas in New Zealand have just been absolutely devastated by cyclone. It's enormous. It's one of the worst things that's happened to that country in recorded history. And a huge amount of the damage has resulted from unsustainable logging practices. Never been a better time to say, we can do this better. We really can.
I'd say that it was a question of will, but at the same time, it's so much more than that at some point.
Yeah.
And I think, yeah, you're absolutely right. And you brought up there's an interesting passage I find at the end of your book. If you don't mind, I'll read it out. And it really brought me to think about, what you see as, this book and these ideas going forward, right? What you see their impact being, where you mentioned that in the next chapter of the human story, we are entering an era of globalization of indigenous wisdom. Now, obviously, there are certain terms like globalization that tend to ring in with a negative tone to certain people, rightfully so, I think. But I don't think you mean it in that sense necessarily. And I'm curious, like, what does this mean to you, right? This particular passage mean to you, and what can it tell us about the impact of what you're talking about going forward?
Absolutely, and I totally get that. Globalization canon is often a dirty word for sure.
Right.
Um, but that statement is a quotation by Clyde Tallio, who is New, and he said that to me, and it echoes a little bit about Spencer Greening from GitGut said something similar, and these are two scholars, and it's interesting because Spencer is a scholar in the Western non-Indigenous system. He's completing his PhD.
Mhm.
Clyde is a scholar who has done his work through traditional educational system at the hands of elders and spent 5 years doing the effective equivalent of a university degree. And it was Clyde who made that, who said that talked about that era of globalization of Indigenous knowledge. And I agree with him. And this is globalization in the best sense, and I'm seeing it in New Zealand as well, working with Indigenous people there as well as here in Canada. I've worked in Costa Rica, and there's just this growing resurgence worldwide, I think, of awareness that this ancient Indigenous knowledge has a huge application in this era, because humanity globally, we can't disconnect from each other with what's happening in Africa and in the North and China and New Zealand and Canada, in Brazil in the rainforest. All of those things impact upon us and wherever we are on the planet. And so when Clyde talks about that, he's talking about it with a sense of hopefulness. And that's why I actually captured that comment in my conclusion in the book, because I agree with them. I think that is where hopefulness lies in the future, not just of the planet, but again, when we talk about, for generations yet unborn, globalizing Indigenous wisdom in the best sense of that word, in the best sense of honoring it and embracing it, is our future.
Interesting. Um, and the last major question I want to ask you in this case, um, one of the major, I think, elements to consider, at least when we're considering Indigenous populations in British Columbia, is the lack of treaties in this case, right? Or the relative lack of treaties compared to other parts of Canada, for example, or even in places like New Zealand and Australia. Um, but I'm curious, right, how you see this reality impacting the way that leadership um, in Indigenous populations operates and will operate going forward, right? Because you mentioned it a little bit during your book, and I'm curious, like, how this seems to you as a reality.
Mm. Well, of course, many of the First Nations in Canada have treaties. There are some in British Columbia who have older treaties and a couple of contemporary treaties in the province. But
Mhm.
I thought hard about this question, and the short answer is I don't think it has any impact whatsoever on this
Interesting.
conversation. And the reason I say that is just going back to a comment I made earlier that Indigenous law predates the Constitution, and treaties are being negotiated in the context of reconciliation of Aboriginal rights and title, which have developed through jurisprudence in Canada, that's developed through Section 35 of the Constitution, but that's still a colonial framework. It's still a colonial driven process, and it's about trying to very specifically define in an area with a line around a map what rights and title mean in practice. Indigenous law predates all of that, and these are systems we're talking about for simply taking care of ourselves and the environment in an integrated fashion that apply right across the country. It doesn't matter where you are, whether you're Mi'kmaq in the Maritimes, whether you're First Nations in British Columbia coast, whether you're Inuit in the north. These ways of taking care of landscape don't have to be predicated on our rights and title, on our system of governance. They're predicated on our relationship with other stewards of the land, the provinces, the territories, and in some cases the federal government, being open to and supporting, because I think communities, I think people like you and me absolutely would support ways of taking care of the environment that are better, that don't have to diminish our ability as fishermen, as loggers, as miners to
Still
earn
be
a
able to live.
living. We can still live, and we can still live very, very well. But it's about that relationship rather than trying to confine it to treaties or other kinds of agreements.
Yeah, I do. I do thoroughly agree in this case, and I do find it interesting, this idea of actively moving beyond such colonial constructions. And it is very difficult. I don't want to diminish the difficulty of having to do that, right? But I do agree with you that it is of vital importance if we want to change really anything, right, about the way that we operate in Canada, or most places in the world, right, who suffer under or continue under colonial, how could I say, hangovers in a sense, if
Well,
that's the proper.
I challenge the statement that it's difficult. I understand the statement that it's difficult,
Okay.
but
Yeah.
I'll put a challenge out there to any of
Okay.
our fellow citizens listening to this who are federal government employees or provincial or territorial government employees to say, actually, this is just about a relationship. And if you set aside, if you try to step out of the box of Aboriginal rights and title, and that is important. Please don't let me be misunderstood as diminishing the
Yeah.
importance of honoring Aboriginal rights and title. But if you think about a lot of the reason that doesn't progress particularly fast or particularly well, I mean, the BC treaty process has been in place since 1991, and is, I think, because of fear. And it's fear of loss of control. It's fear of, if we agree that those rights exist for Indigenous peoples, that we're not going to have rights. If you remove yourself from that fear into how can we just work together as a better society and enable good stewardship practices and good relationships, there's nothing to fear as a society. There's nothing to fear from a government point of view to to look forward and say, actually, what we would be designing together is a better future for everybody.
Interesting. Yeah, I feel like we could talk about that for a while, but no, but it's a good point. And as we wrap up in this case, I'm curious if you would be interested in reading a section of your book in order to give readers a taste of what perhaps you're working with or what you've written. But yeah, I know some people don't like to read necessarily out loud, so feel free not to if you don't want.
I'm happy to. The trick was picking what to
Of course.
read because, all of the stories in the book are quite different. There are all
Mhm.
these common themes that run through, and how do you tell that story and get the most out of it? So actually, I thought the best way to illustrate some of the things that we've been talking about. One of the people in the book is Megan Moody, who just want to shout out to Megan because she was one of my readers ahead of time as well. And she gave me a very useful suggestion that I draw together some of those common themes into a conclusion. And so I'm very grateful to her for that because actually that made so much sense. And I called the conclusion for the generations yet unborn. So I'll just read a small 3 or 4 paragraphs from that, if I may.
Fantastic.
When I started work on this book, I asked a remarkable group of Indigenous individuals to speak about how people, place, and well-being are linked, and the ways in which their own connections to the places they are from are reflected in the different paths in life that they are following, the work that they are doing to take care of those places, each other, and their communities. I expected a wide-ranging conversation. After all, the group included scientists, tourism operators, business people, politicians, hereditary chiefs, executives and administrators, environmental stewards and monitors, fisheries workers, cultural and language workers, students, academics and teachers, artists and photographers, journalists and writers, youth and youth workers, elders, engineers, handymen, housing managers, and the list goes on. And indeed, all of them reflected on the theme of connection in different ways. They have all taken different approaches to improving the well-being of their homelands and their communities, depending on their location, circumstances, challenges, and opportunities. But they also, without exception, talked about the many things that they have in common, threads that ended up weaving themselves through the fabric of every story in the book. For example, they made it clear that they are not defined by colonization and its legacy. Instead, they are defining themselves on their own terms. In whatever role they happen to be, they are reviving the values, laws, and the old ways of being of their ancestors in these places and applying them to the best of their ability in a 21st century context. It is a journey as much about reclaiming cultural autonomy as it is about exercising age old governance responsibilities and rights that were never forgotten or willingly relinquished. As these stories demonstrate, although every community and nation has different approaches to restoring and improving the well-being of their places and the same fundamental principles underlie all of those approaches. The inseparability of people and the landscapes in which they live, holding on to values that have been passed down the generations, such as respect for all things, including all living creatures, and ensuring the sustainable use of natural resources while protecting the territory. These are ways of living and being that we can all learn a great deal from. Spencer Greening points out, Indigenous people have experienced massive environmental change, floods, wildfires, and all kinds of other natural crises over 10,000 years of stewardship of our territories and learned how to deal with them. Through that deep, deep history of learning, the values, spiritual teachings, rituals, and laws we developed have helped us not only survive but thrive. When a society has a way of being through thousands upon thousands of years, human ingenuity and brilliance just pour out of that, out of these Indigenous ways of being. That is how we could and should imagine our future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Um, and yeah, no, I think that sums up pretty much what we were talking about today in a very adept, yeah, concise way. And I'm curious, and I always ask this question to people I interview. Is there anything I didn't ask today? And I'm curious, what's the answer to that question?
That's a lovely question. I try to ask that at the end of every interview as well, because it usually draws out a very rich response. But your questions have been incredibly thought, and I thank you for that. It's a conversation. I'm very conscious just in having an interview and having a conversation about the book of being sure to honor the voices in the book. And um, if anything, I just would like to just again give a shout out to everybody who gave their time and shared their stories in the book, which I appreciate so hugely, and I'm incredibly honoured to have been able to be a writer who can help amplify those voices in a good way.
And can you tell listeners where they can maybe find the book and when it's going to be released?
The book is going to be available at all of your independent bookstores across the country, I would hope. Harbour Publishing is the publisher. They also published my previous book, We're Born with the Songs Inside Us. So it's always available directly from the website. The official release date is early May, but I understand the books are likely to be available earlier than that. They might even be available by the end of this month. So a pre-order can ensure that the book will be in everybody's hands as soon as possible. And don't forget, the royalties will go to the conservation fund held by Coast Funds for all of the First Nations. So if you do buy the book, you're helping contribute to a very good cause.
I read an advanced reading copy, and I certainly will buy an official copy for
Oh,
that reason
fabulous,
alone.
Pat. Thank you.
Um, and yeah, are you working on anything new already, or are you taking a little break from writing before you go on to any?
I do have a project in mind that I've started playing around with a little bit. It's a bit different because, as I say, I've always worked on telling other people's stories. And it occurred to me late last year that, wondering about what my story is actually in the context of connection to place. My mother is French from Brittany, and if you look at the history of Brittany, it goes back 7,000 years of people in place. And I thought, I wonder if there's a story to tell. I think there is. I'm exploring, my own ancestral roots and what it means to me that my history goes back there, although I've never lived there.
Mhm.
What does connection to place mean there in the context as a settler in Canada? For me, does understanding my own ancestral connection to place uh, help me in terms of understanding and empathy with Indigenous people here who've been connected to these places? For our own particular little corners of Canada that we've settled on, will it give us more of a sense of responsibility to take care of these little places that we call home, that we've connected to now as Canadians, and we say our places, and help build that empathy, help build that relationship with the country we now call home. So that's not a very well crystallized concept yet for a writing project, but that's what I'm thinking about doing next.
Well, it certainly seems more crystallized than a lot of the projects that I have, so I think that's already a good place to start. But honestly, thank you very much for your time today. So you can just once again, the name of the book is This Place Is Who We Are by Katherine Palmer Gordon. Thank you very much for joining us on the show today. And yeah, it was a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Pat.